Hello and welcome back to the Fall of the Roman Empire. My name is Nick Holmes and this is episode 37 called War with the Goths. In the last episode, you'll remember we discussed why the Huns suddenly appeared on the edge of Europe in the late 4th century AD. Was it because of defeat by Han China centuries earlier? Or was it other tribal conflicts of which no records have survived? Or was it because of climate change and a mega drought that lasted 50 years on the Asian steppe? My sense is that the evidence increasingly points to the latter. But whatever the reason, their appearance was a game changer and it would transform the political and military status quo in Europe and in the Roman Empire over the next 100 years. And for the Romans, when did this begin? It was the appearance of around 200,000 Goths on the edge of the Danube River in the year 376. But this time, they didn't want to plunder the empire. They wanted asylum from the dreaded Huns. This unexpected intrusion on the Roman world caught the Eastern Emperor Valens off guard. He was actually massing the Eastern Roman army at Antioch in 376 in preparation to meet the Persian Shah Shapur in battle. Now, Shapur had objected to Valens's assassination of the Armenian king Pap and his replacement by a pro-Roman stooge called Varazdat. Shapur was finally free from fighting the Kushans on his eastern frontier and was infuriated that Valens had ignored the peace treaty he'd made in 363 with Jovian, which clearly stated that the Romans were to abandon any pretensions they had to controlling Armenia. So it looked as if Rome and Persia were both ready to return to their favourite and mutually destructive pastime of fighting over Armenia. Now, with all of this going on in the east, not surprisingly, the Danube frontier was a bit short of Roman troops. And because of this, Valens initially adopted a rather conciliatory stance towards them. In addition, requests for asylum like this were not unheard of. Indeed, even the Emperor Tiberius in the 1st century AD had allowed 40,000 Germans to settle in Gaul, according to the Roman historian Eutropius. And this practice had continued during the Pax Romana, albeit with fairly small numbers involved. However, as Rome began its decline, the numbers started to grow, and Marcus Aurelius allowed several barbarian groups to settle in the empire in response to the major Germanic invasions during his reign. But during this time, the key point was that the Romans followed very strict rules, which were essentially that barbarians were only allowed to settle on Roman territory once they'd been defeated, disarmed, and integrated politically into the empire, essentially as peasant farmers. But Valens chose to break this rule by allowing some of the Goths to cross the Danube still fully armed and still as an independent political unit. It would prove a costly mistake. So, just why did he do this? Well, there are several possible reasons. First, he knew the Gothic leader of the Tuvingi tribe personally. This was a man called Fritigern, and he regarded him as a more acceptable type of barbarian. The reason for this was that Fritigern had helped him in the First Gothic War in 367-69, when Valens had successfully beat off the Goths, who came to support Procopius, as I mentioned in the last episode. And at that time, the marauding Goths were led by a Turvingi chief called Athanaric, but Fritigern was a rival chieftain who sided with Valens to fight Athanaric. Fritigern also converted to Christianity, so when, 7 years later, Fritigern appeared on the Danube asking for asylum, Valens regarded him as a quasi-Roman ally. Another reason is that he certainly didn't give the Goths carte blanche to cross the Danube en masse. It was only Fritigern's Turvingi who he allowed to cross. He forbade the other major Gothic tribe called the Grutungi, who were at least half of the 200,000, to join them. He also insisted that Fritigern's senior men converted to Christianity, as Fritigern himself had done. As normal, hostages from the Tuvingi were taken to guarantee good conduct, and there was also almost certainly an agreement that the Tuvingi would supply soldiers for the Roman army. Now, this latter point was important to Valens because he was, of course, building his army to fight Shapur, and he didn't mind having a few additional regiments of Gothic auxiliaries. But the thing that Valens may have seriously underestimated was the sheer number of Goths, because the Tervingi were probably around 100,000 people, men, women and children, and suddenly having an additional 100,000 mouths to feed in the Thracian countryside inevitably put pressure on food supplies. Suspecting that there might be trouble, the Romans had moved the harvest of 376 to fortified strongpoints which could resist the Goths. This was a smart idea, but it also meant that some unscrupulous Romans could try to exploit the situation. And this was exactly what happened, according to Ammianus, who says it was Roman greed that became the match that lit the Gothic bonfire. For the Roman governor of Thrace, a man called Lupicinus, and his general called Maximus, decided that the starving Goths represented an opportunity to get rich quick by selling them overpriced food. Apparently they even gathered up stray dogs for the Goths to eat, and offered one dog in exchange for a child to be sold in slavery. Whether that really happened or not, it's no surprise the Goths became increasingly unhappy with the Romans. So they started protesting outside the legionary fortress at Marcianople, which was in eastern Thrace close to the Black Sea. Now Lupicinus, who must be regarded as one of the most incompetent governors in the whole of Roman history, responded by gathering most of his troops that were stationed along the Danube to intimidate them. But this only meant that the other main Gothic tribe, the Grutungi, who had been barred from crossing the Danube, now took advantage of the absence of Roman sentries and crossed over to join their cousins, the Tervingi. So, double trouble. Faced with an ever-increasing number of Goths and sensing that things were about to get out of hand, Lupicinus resorted to a favourite Roman trick. This was to invite the Gothic leaders to a grand banquet and then kidnap or kill them. Now, you may remember that although the Romans liked doing this, it wasn't normally very successful. Indeed, you may remember in episode 35 we heard about the disastrous consequences when the Roman governor of Moesia, Marcellianus, had assassinated the king of the Quadi at a banquet. This only caused a Quadi invasion of Roman territory, which then forced the Western Emperor Valentinian to negotiate with the Quadi, which, as I'm sure you will recall, caused him to lose his temper so much that he died from a stroke. But Lupicinus's banquet was much worse, because he spectacularly mismanaged the kidnapping and or assassination attempt. Ammianus suggests that this was because he was enjoying the banquet too much himself. Quote, Lupicinus, who, after a long sitting at an extravagantly luxurious meal followed by a noisy floor show, was muzzy and dropping with sleep, end quote. What followed is not entirely clear from the Roman sources, but it seems Lupicinus didn't spring his trap on Fritigern immediately. Perhaps the two of them were actually becoming friends as they enjoyed the floor show. Who knows? But what did spoil the party was that during this banquet, fighting broke out between the Goths and Roman soldiers outside the town, as the Goths demanded food and the Romans refused. When this news was brought to Lupicinus, he panicked and seized Fritigern and killed his bodyguard. But Fritigern cleverly managed to persuade him that if he killed him, the Goths would just storm the town. So instead he persuaded Lupicinus that if he released him, he would go out and pacify his followers and everything would be fine. Quite why Lupicinus fell for this is anyone's guess. Perhaps he'd had too much to drink, as Ammianus says. But whatever the reason, he released Fritigern, who rejoined his Goths outside the town, to their great cries of jubilation, and immediately went back on his promise to Lupicinus by telling his men the Romans had betrayed him, and it was now war. So Lupicinus had started the war he was trying to avoid. The very next day, he decided to rely on his soldiers to sort out the mess he'd created. So he gathered his men and marched to meet Fritigern. but his incompetence was further compounded on the battlefield. We don't have any details about the battle, but the Goths trounced the Romans, who, according to Ammianus, suffered considerable casualties, losing both their standards and several tribunes. However, Lupicinus managed to escape, as Ammianus says, quote, "While others were fighting, his one aim was to get away," end quote. Part of the explanation for the miserable performance of the Roman troops was probably that these soldiers were second-rate garrison troops, the limitanii as the Romans called them, and not the mobile field army or comitatenses, which would have had far superior soldiers. This, together with Lupicinus's gross incompetence, now ignited a Roman Gothic war that would last from late 376 until 382, and which would prove a major turning point in Rome's history. By eliminating Lupicinus's regiments, the Goths now had control of the countryside of Thrace, since the only other substantial Roman forces were those in Illyria, under the Western Emperor's command, and Valens's eastern units, which were massing in faraway Syria to fight the Sasanians. And let me just mention, since I haven't done this up until now, that the Western Emperor was Gratian, who was Valentinian's son, and who succeeded him smoothly and was by all accounts a hard-working and well-meaning emperor. To return to the Goths, they had control of the countryside, as I mentioned, but not of the towns. And this was because all the major towns were heavily fortified, and the Goths had no expertise in siege warfare at all. The credit for the fortified towns must go to Diocletian, whose idea it was, as we discussed in episode 20, to construct extensive fortifications in all the frontier provinces, especially for the major towns and cities. What archaeological evidence we have suggests that these walled towns were extremely well fortified, with tall walls and often huge U-shaped bastions designed to carry the brutally effective Roman wall artillery. Against this, the Goths stood little chance. So what they did instead was to pillage and plunder the Roman villas that dotted the countryside. Archaeological evidence indicates there were substantial numbers of these in the regions around Marcianople and Adrianople. The region had enjoyed great prosperity during the 4th century, benefiting from the relatively safer frontier along the lower Danube since the last Gothic invasions of the 3rd century, the booming 4th century Roman economy, and of course the growth of the great city of Constantinople. These affluent centres were now put to the torch, and their inhabitants, if they had not already fled, were killed, raped and enslaved. However, not everyone suffered. Considerable numbers of slaves and poorer peasants chose this moment to rise up against their masters and take revenge for their mistreatment. The Gothic ranks were also swelled by a regiment of Gothic auxiliaries stationed in Adrianople. These auxiliaries were still led by their two chieftains, Sueridas and Colias, but were otherwise loyal to the empire, or at least they were, until they received orders to march immediately east to get them out of the way of the oncoming Tervingi. When they hesitated to leave, the town governor and the citizens turned on them and tried to force them out of the city, perhaps understandably worried that there might be a Gothic coup. However, Ammianus regarded the citizens as almost as incompetent in dealing with the Goths as Lupicinus. The Gothic auxiliaries were offended that they were viewed as potential traitors and came to blows with the citizens. There was some fighting in which Ammianus says many citizens were killed, and the Goths did leave Adrianople, but only to join Fritigern. Now, while all of this was going on, Valens was still in Antioch, and it's not difficult to imagine his reaction to the news of this Gothic invasion when he was putting the finishing touches to his projected offensive in Armenia against the Sasanians. The last word he'd received about the Goths was that they were seeking asylum in the empire and could provide a valuable source of auxiliary troops. Now he was told there was a full-scale war in Thrace, in which the Roman army had been trounced and huge damage done to a hitherto prosperous and peaceful province very close to the empire's new capital. Although Valens didn't burst a blood vessel as his brother Valentinian had done, he might understandably have come pretty close to it. However, once he'd had a chance to absorb the bad news, his response was measured and sensible. He'd already asked his nephew, the Western Emperor Gratian, for help to fight the Persians, and now he sent messengers urgently asking for help to fight the Goths. Second, and probably with great reluctance, he cancelled his whole Persian expedition. He sent his general Count Victor, who you will recall had been a hero in Julian's ill-fated Persian campaign, to sue for peace with Persia. Shapur demanded that the Romans gave up their attempts to control Armenia and that they recognise his own king in the kingdom of Georgia in the Caucasus, known as Iberia, which was hitherto both Christian and pro-Roman. These demands were accepted, and the Persians yet again regained the initiative in the east. Once this was done, Valens was free to move the eastern army west towards Thrace and the Goths. By the summer of 377, two generals from the eastern front, Trajanus and Profuturus, arrived with the first batch of troops from the east. At the same time, Gratian sent a small force under his general, Ricimer, through the Suki Pass in what is now western Bulgaria to join them. The Goths retreated north back towards the Danube. The two Roman forces joined up and decided to offer battle to the Goths. At a place called Ad Salices, in the narrow piece of land between the Danube and the Black Sea, the two armies joined battle. There are no detailed accounts of what happened, but it seems to have been a bloody slogging match that resulted in a draw. Ammianus describes the battlefield littered with corpses. The Goths withdrew into the safety of their wagon circle for a week, suggesting they'd sustained pretty heavy casualties, and the Romans withdrew to Marcianople. It was now a stalemate until the Goths were reinforced by a large number of Huns and Alans, who, having heard of the enormous booty to be stolen from the Romans, were eager to participate in the raiding and plunder. However, the Romans were also getting stronger. By early 378, the bulk of Valens's eastern army started to arrive in the vicinity of Constantinople. However, Valens didn't want to commit to a fight until he also had Gratian's support from the west. This meant that the Goths, with their Hun and Alan allies, were able to devastate Thrace yet again. Quote, "The barbarians poured over the wide extent of Thrace like wild animals escaping from their cage," end quote, as Ammianus put it. This time it was even more brutal than the last time, if that was possible. Quote, "Everything was involved in a foul orgy of rape and slaughter, bloodshed and fire and frightful atrocities," end quote. However, the major cities and Constantinople itself were, as before, safe. The Goths were in awe of Constantinople's strong walls, even though these were not yet the famous Theodosian walls, which can still be seen in modern Istanbul, and they were also put off, according to one Roman account, when some Goths near the city were attacked by a group of Arab auxiliaries working for the Romans, who took them prisoner, slit their throats, and drank their blood. The Goths were apparently appalled by this behaviour and never ventured near the city again. Meanwhile, the ever-growing Roman army in Constantinople merely looked on at the horrific devastation of Thrace and did nothing. The reason was that Valens was waiting for Gratian and the combined might of the Western and Eastern Roman armies. But the Western army had been delayed. For just as he was setting out to join Valens in early 378, Gratian had been diverted by a major attack on the Rhine by a tribe of Alemanni called the Lentienses. This happened in February 378, and the ensuing conflict wasn't resolved until May, when Gratian won a resounding victory. This also made Valens look bad. His army had been sitting in Constantinople doing nothing for months, and although the city itself was safe, its citizens, with whom he'd never been popular since he had no Constantinian blood, were daily ridiculing him for his cowardice in not attacking the Goths. When the news of Gratian's victory over the Alemanni arrived, it was too much, and there were calls for Valens to be replaced by Gratian. Valens started to feel the pressure. Although by August 378 Gratian was genuinely on his way and his army was marching rapidly through Illyria towards Thrace, other news also reached Valens. One of his generals, called Sebastian, won a resounding victory over a Gothic warband near Adrianople. Indeed, Fritigern was sufficiently alarmed to withdraw to the north of the city. Valens was very encouraged by this and began to wonder whether he could inflict a resounding defeat on the rest of the Goths all by himself and boost his image with his many critics. So he advanced the eastern army towards Adrianople. Scouts informed him that only the Turvingi were in the area led by Fritigern. The Grutungi and their Hunnic and Alan allies were widely dispersed around Thrace. The Turvingi warriors were reported to number about 10,000. Against this, Valens had around 30,000 troops, including the elite regiments of the Eastern Army. Valens was tempted to attack on his own. The taunting of the Constantinopolitan mob, the months spent waiting in vain for Gratian to arrive, and according to Ammianus, his growing jealousy of Gratian all meant that, in short, he was a man with a lot to prove. As Ammianus said, quote, he was eager to put himself on a level with his nephew, i.e. Gratian, whose exploits irked him by some glorious deed of his own, end quote. Then just at that very moment, Gratian's general Ricimer actually arrived in person to say that the Western army was only a few days' march away. Valens called a council of war and asked his generals for their opinions. Although some seasoned veterans, like Count Victor, advised him to wait, Count Sebastian in particular boasted of his recent victory over the Goths and said that they could easily win without Gratian. Ammianus says that the flattery of others decided Valens to opt for battle immediately. Quote, they urged him immediate action to prevent Gratian sharing in a victory which in their opinion was already as good as won. End quote. So, the next day, on the 9th of August, AD 378, Valens rode north from the city of Adrianople with his army to meet the Goths who were encamped only a few miles away. He rode to meet his destiny, but it was not to be the destiny he hoped for. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, of course, I'd be delighted as ever for any ratings or reviews in whichever podcast app you use. And next week, we'll hear what happened to Valens at the Battle of Adrianople. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.